Welcome to the Antidote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth Cushel.
We are recording here about a little before 2 p.m. on Monday, March 16th, and everything has just completely shut down here in the United States. With since the last program we did on Wednesday, we've had as we were live, as we were on air, as we were recording on Wednesday, you'd received a text that the World Health Organization had declared the uh, COVID-19, a coronavirus, a global pandemic. And then within about, I'd say, 12 hours of our recording, we had all of these major events, all the major sporting companies and a lot of major entertainment industries just started completely shutting everything down. And then on Friday, the President, Trump, officially came out and declared a national state of emergency. And now we're
Those are
seeing the
two
effects.
big words. National emergency.
Yes, yes. And any questions about taking that removing the pandemic response team is just disrespectful.
I take no responsibility.
anyhow, anyhow, so we've seen all of this play out in the last several days, and now just over the weekend we've continued to see the consequences of this with I believe some of the major cities are just completely starting to close restaurants and taverns. Here in Kansas City, and by the way, we're about to get into an article dealing with Kansas City history as it relates to the last major, I guess, global pandemic to this level, which would be the so-called, at least as it's called, Spanish flu in 1918. But here in Kansas City, we've had the mayor come out and canceled any events with gatherings of 50 or more people for the next 8 weeks. So, that's pretty drastic actions, but it shows that, in our last show, we kind of questioned, well, how is the U.S. going to respond to this? And we got to say, at least on the surface, in terms of canceling major events, gatherings of people getting together, I guess minus airports, where I guess there's still all kinds of chaos going on at the airports as a result of this travel ban. Definitely actions being taken, and we'll see where this goes. But I'll say the last thing before we move on into into what we're going to, into a couple of articles we're going to read from, is that regardless of what this does and does not pan out to be, the ramifications and consequences just from the global scale of this and all the action that's being taken is going to be felt, I think, very, very into the distant future. So.
Yes, and so maybe, as we talked about the potential larger implications on our last recording about this in terms of the potential long-term economic and political considerations, maybe we'll ground this a little bit more in our specific places that we reside in, whether Kansas City, Missouri, or Lawrence, Kansas here, and relate that to the background of history and a historical analysis that might be helpful and elucidating in relationship to certain patterns or things that we are seeing in relationship to this novel coronavirus global pandemic now. And I do, in relationship to what you said, over here in Kansas, things are shutting down very quickly. At the very end of last week, the schools began to shut down, and now the city stuff is shutting down. And I have to retract my prediction that I had made that the United States was going to take forever to shut down our bread and circus churches of some sort of the sports industrial complex, and that even that has very quickly being shut down as we'd headed into potential March Madness even over there in Kansas City, but also the NBA. So things are happening much more quickly than I anticipated, and a lot of this is probably very wise. At the same time, there are these bigger things that we need to keep our eye on and to do an analysis of.
Yeah, I agree with you, and and I will say though that is very impactful itself. In that, if nothing else, there's a lot, sports owners and CEOs are giving away, or lots and lots of millions, if not possibly even closer to the $1 billion range of a lot of money that was definitely going to be coming into their respective leagues and respective cities. So this is something that is on the scale that we've never seen before. And as I said, we'll see how. I think you're going to see the ramifications of this in different ways are going to be felt for quite a while. I think certainly on into the rest of 2020 and then from there into the future. So, Jeremy, we're going to read from two articles today. And they're both, as you said, related to our local respective areas. But they do, I think, will definitely be relevant. I think to anybody who listens to this program, as far as the respective topics that these articles discuss. The first article we're going to read from is from Kansas City Star, kansascity.com. And do you want to comment before we get started?
I just want to, very briefly, I just want to say the framing of this is more and more there's a meme and analysis that's people are becoming aware of. And I'm not sure whether I've mentioned it before, but the difference between Philadelphia in relationship to the 1918, what we might be start calling the so-called Spanish so-called flu, potentially, versus the actions of St. Louis, and how Philadelphia had resisted shutting things down, had done a big parade, and then had death rates and a spike in death rates in relationship to what was called the Spanish flu, much more severe than what St. Louis had, which was much more sort of graduated and sort of more truncated and smoothing the curve that's being talked about right now, that the United States has already lost any opportunity to really potentially contain. And so the real thing going forward right now is the danger of the overwhelming of the health, the hospital system in terms of ICU beds, access to negative pressure rooms, access to ventilators. If the numbers of people with more severe cases of the, coming down in relationship to the virus. And there's a lot of pieces of this that we'll put aside for now, which include that it looks like the severity of cases very likely come down to things like if your body gets overwhelmed, for example, you're a medical worker and you're surrounded, or you get like a big load of virus, that the idea of viral load is a key piece in terms of the potential severity of cases. So that's why it makes a lot of sense, not only for people to really begin wearing masks if they're out and about, for both sides of it, for reducing the potential virus coming in, but also the potential virus going out, and that it's still very clear that people who don't show any symptoms, either because they have a very mild case or that they're pre-symptomatic, that actually people who are showing very few symptoms can potentially produce the largest viral loads, actually, and can spread the disease without being asymptomatic. Okay, so that's the framework in reading this article about how Kansas City responded to the 1918 pandemic, and so it's interesting. So as people learn more and more about the difference between Philadelphia and St. Louis in relationship to whatever their take is on why everything's shutting down, and whether it's wise or not, or whether it's an extreme overreaction, or if it's political, or that, to begin to consider these different isolated and specific experiences of different cities in the United States of America from 100 years ago, as they were encountering some similar type of biological phenomenon.
Yes, thank you for that. And on this note, I'm going to read first of two articles we're going to look into today. The first is this is from kansascity.com, just published yesterday on March 15th. A coronavirus lesson? How KC's response to 1918 flu pandemic caused needless death, by Eric Adler. And this is from the website of the Kansas City Star, the local major newspaper here. So, and I'm going to start reading this article here. The news walloped Kansas City like a Jack Dempsey uppercut. A drastic ban is on, shouted the bold headline of the Kansas City Star on October 17, 1918. So-called Spanish influenza had been raving the city since late September. Hundreds in town were sick and dying of the Purple Death. in quotations. Over the next 27 weeks, the flu would kill an estimated 2,300 people in Kansas City, giving it a mortality rate greater than New York, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and even St. Louis, a city with more than 2.5 times Kansas City's population at the time. The reason, standing perhaps as a cautionary tale in the face of the spread of the global coronavirus pandemic, is that Kansas City failed in spectacular fashion to responsibly deal with the contagion when it had the chance, experts say now. On Thursday, Kansas City Mayor Quinton Lucas, backed by the health department, declared a citywide state of emergency, canceling all events with more than 1,000 people and halting non-essential travel for city employees. President Donald Trump and the governors of Kansas and Missouri soon declared emergencies as well. And as an update, as of today, the mayor of Kansas City has declared all gatherings of 50 or more people, I guess minus like official, restaurant-style business, schools, although that could change as well, but a moratorium on gatherings of 50 or more people, at least for the next 8 weeks. So that's an update on the citywide state of emergency, which was limited to events with more than 1,000 people. So now it's gone from 1,000 to gatherings of more than 50. So, quote, protecting all of our residents remains our top priority, Lucas said of the COVID-19 outbreak, which means that how we interact over the weeks and months ahead will need to change dramatically, end quote. That did not happen soon enough in 1918. Instead, as historians documented, Kansas City, unlike its rival St. Louis, which quickly shut down businesses and quarantined the city, adopted a keep businesses open approach and political squabbling that would have fatal effects. People died, said Susan Sykes Berry, a retired Kansas City librarian whose 2010 master's thesis, Politics and Pandemic in 1918 Kansas City, describes the wranglings that resulted in Kansas City becoming one of the hardest hit cities in the nation. But in the end, the town of some 250,000 people would emerge from the epidemic with a death rate of 718 people per 100,000 population, the 17th worst among 50 large American cities. The actual worst, Pittsburgh, would rate a log of 1,240 per 100,000, but Cleveland would have a rate of 590, New York at 582, St. Louis at 536, with Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit even lower. The lesson I took away from it, Barry told the Star last week, quote, is that money does not buy your health, end quote. The Kansas flu? Question mark. In many ways, the epidemic was already on its way to doing its worst in Kansas City by the time city leaders acted together to beat it back in late 1918. Globally, the flu killed at least 50 million people, more than double the number that died during the bubonic plague of the Middle Ages. Effective at once to remain in effect immediately, the Star story continued. Then came the list of closings. All theaters and motion picture shows, all schools, all churches, public gatherings of 20 or more persons, including dances, parties, weddings, funerals. Crowding in stores was forbidden, restricted to no more than 25 persons. Music or amusements in hotels, bars, and restaurants, forbidden. Streetcars could carry no more than 20 standing passengers. All elevators and streetcars would be sterilized daily. Telephone booths would be sterilized twice a day. Streets would be deluged in water. A small army of quarantine officers were to be dispatched to face what was then, as it remains today, the deadliest period in Kansas City history. More lives would be lost from the flu in Kansas City than deaths of Kansas Cityans fighting in all of World War I. While the measures seem extensive, they had been poorly coordinated. Our public response was delayed and dysfunctional, said David McKenzie, a Kansas City infectious disease physician and lead author with his brother physician Joel McKenzie, and I might not be pronouncing this correctly, Maite Enriquez, of a 2018 Missouri Medicine paper on the flu in Kansas City. The exact source of the Spanish flu is unclear, but some have come to believe that it should have been called the Kansas flu. It's thought to have taken root in early March 1918 among World War I soldiers at Camp Funston, part of Fort Riley in Geary and Riley counties. Careful readers then, looking back, might have sensed something different out there. On April 3rd, the Star ran a small item with an odd headline, Rain Ends Queer Epidemic. Okay. Hundreds of school children in Mexico, Missouri, near Columbia, had been flattened for days by a mysterious bug. Doctors suspected it was some sort of form of flu, but speculated that recent rains had, quote, ended the epidemic. In the surrounding weeks, several thousand soldiers at Camp Funston would also be treated for a flu that killed 38 men. Soon tens of thousands of soldiers trained in Kansas were off to the battlefields of France, Belgium, and Italy. 6 to 8 months later, said John Barry, author of The Great Influenza, the epic story of the deadliest plague in history, it exploded simultaneously on 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and the United States. Then, as now, Kansas Cityans had known the flu was precariously close to home. On September 24th, a muted headline in the Kansas City Times ran tucked below war news regarding the enemy Huns of Germany. Quote, influenza coming west, end quote. Few understood its fury. The influenza was violent. This influenza killed, Barry wrote. No mere cold, the flu caused a swift and wrenching death with a killing rate 25 times higher than milder forms. In hours, healthy individuals could go from having what seemed like a cough to developing pneumonia that engorged the lungs with fluid, then blood. Violent hacking contorted bodies as victims struggled to breathe. With lungs filled to uselessness, oxygen disappeared and victims quickly turned blue. The purple death, in quotations. First, the mahogany patches rose near the cheekbones and ears, then they spread across the face. People turned so dark near death, reported one army physician in the day's vernacular. It became hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. Headline after headline warned that the illness was drawing close to Kansas City. September 26, a.m., influenza in 26 states. The September 26, p.m., grip spreads in Army. At camps, 5,000 new cases were reported yesterday. September 27th, p.m., grip doubles death rate. Then the flu hit town, often afflicting healthy people, between 15 and 35, first and hardest. The youngest and oldest came later. The first cases, the McKinseys note, were reported in the last week of September at the Sweeney Automobile and Tractor School, a private building at 24th Street and Baltimore Avenue that had been converted for military use. Within a week, 800 fell ill, the McKinsey paper notes. On Sunday, September 29th, the Star reported that a woman with what is believed to be the first case of the Spanish flu outside the Army had been admitted to General Hospital. She was Mary Riley, an employee of the Hotel Muhlebach. Others note the first civilian cases might have come days earlier from Fred Harvey's restaurant at Union Station. Within a week, Kansas City Mayor James Cowgill and health authorities issued an order to close all schools, theaters, and churches until the epidemic subsided. But conflict soon erupted between factions allied to 2 influential Democratic political bosses, Tom Pendergast and Joseph B. Shannon. Pendergast had yet to rise to full power. The problem was that Tom Pendergast and Joe Shannon were dividing up the city 50-50, Barry said. What that did was make institutions unworkable. Health officials were among them. 2 sides made their stances. On one side were physicians A.J. Gannon, director of the Health Department's Infectious Disease Department, and his ally E.H. Bullock, the Kansas City Health Director and Superintendent at General Hospital. They both supported a prolonged quarantine. On the other side were Mayor Cowgill and W.T. Motley, a non-physician who was president of General Hospital and the Health Department. Siding with business merchants, including Pendergast, who controlled many saloons, they were for lifting the quarantine. It was business interests. They didn't want to shut down the city, Barry said. So they didn't. On October 14th, an initial ban was lifted. One disapproving Army medical officer from Camp Funston warned, the responsibility for 400,000 lives in Kansas City lies in the balance. Another officer, Captain A.A. Hobbs, responded curtly when assured that a ban could always be reinstated. A dead man cannot accept apologies, Hobbs said. Those selfish interests that have been besieging the municipal authorities in order that they may continue to make money will now find that their selfishness will cost them far more dearly than if they had actively and willingly cooperated in protecting the public health. A Kansas City Journal editorial railed against those who lifted the quarantine. Just as Gannon and Bullock feared, infections and deaths immediately rose when the ban was lifted. 3 days later, the drastic ban splashed on the front of the Star would go into effect, although only for a month. Few local chronicles exist detailing daily life at that time. News stories recount nursing shortages and hospitals flooded with the sick and dying. A 50th anniversary piece on the epidemic appeared in the Missouri Historical Review in 1968. The author detailed stories of nuns and priests waiting at hospitals and greeting ambulances to give last rites to individuals who had died before reaching the doors. The main preventive of the day was isolation. Health authorities suggested clean diets, fresh air, and bed rest. Doctors gave aspirin for pain and fever. Oxygen by mask was used to quell the blue cyanosis. Epinephrine, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, was given for the pneumonia. One man, a non-smoker, began smoking cigarettes in the belief that it would protect his lungs. Another hung skunk oil around his neck. A woman ate mounds of, quote, protective yeast. Barry, the author, Barry, the author, said the experience in Kansas City would have been similar to experiences in other cities. You're seeing panic in the streets, quite literally, he said. Understand that the vast majority of people who got sick had a terrible few days, and a week later they were fine. But you didn't know when you got sick and you had your first cough if you were going to be dead in 72 hours or if you were going to be fine. That was part of the terror. You've got the Red Cross reporting that people are starving to death, not because there is not enough food, but because people are too terrified to bring them food. It became every person for himself and herself, and society began to disintegrate. And on the throwing in a note on that last line about the line of, if you were sick, you did not know if you were going to be dead in 72 hours, if you were going to be fine. That's part of the problem with something like this, that it's something we haven't seen before, and people genuinely do not know if they're going to be okay or not. And that's part of the reason why we're treating this so much differently from other illnesses that are much more well known and identified and understood. So I mean, I think that's
Yeah. Yes. I agree with that completely because there's on a lot of different sides, there's sort of a blitheness or an assumptiveness about what people believe they know about the aspects of this virus and how it then affects, disease in the human body in a way that we don't yet have enough information to know either way, especially considering the potential origins of it. And we don't really yet understand if let's say that it is some kind of manufactured virus of some sort with inserts of different kinds of virus backgrounds, where if you thought about it, let's say from these early reports that have allegedly been retracted, I guess, from the Indian scientists who talked about the similarity of HIV inserts, that would then suggest that it could potentially operate more like the way that something like HIV or even something like herpes operates, where it's not really necessarily something that you can gain immunity towards. It's more something that you manage once you get it or something like that. And there are a lot of scientific papers that begin to suggest how evasive and what people are calling smart the virus is, and the way that it moves from body system to body system. It looks like it can even hide in aspects of the human nervous system and the brain stem, reemerge. It looks like it attacks some aspect in between the lung functions in relationship to oxygen, but also in relationship to the blood. Interesting analysis of the attack on heme iron, the iron functions in the body in terms of the reason why the blood is red in the first place, because it's full of oxygen. So there's an aspect of this where we don't know. And so even if we were to say, okay, and I pointed out before that, that it looked like in terms of this 1918 pandemic, that the first bloom really hit the elders in the most deadly fashion. Mm-hmm. But then the second bloom hit the youngsters in the most deadly fashion. So even if we were to say that it looks like children are not intensely affected by this time around, just because we don't know where it goes or mutations, or they're already talking about potential multiple strains of this act in different ways. But even without that, anticipating the future, we don't even know quite yet enough about the way that this thing operates, whether it actually operates as similar to like a flu, or it operates more like a long-term, something like HIV or herpes simplex, where it's just perdurable and you sort of deal with it and manage it, try to, eliminate it from within the system rather than some type of aspect of herd immunity. So I would just urge a sense of humility in the sense of this, while also gaining, personal power and strength via taking care of our bodies and figuring out what's going on.
Yes, I agree with you very much. And so, you've got people out there saying, don't worry about this. And I wouldn't give those people, really, I wouldn't put much stock into what they're saying until we know more about this. I mean, with the benefit of hindsight, we can always find out, but that's definitely not the correct stance to be taking, certainly at a time like this, while we don't really have hardly any information. We're still not familiar with the ins and outs of this, there's a lot more information that needs to be had before people start to,
Ex-
people should not be taking that type of mentality or mindset.
exactly. Like two simple statements are err on the side of caution and first do no harm, right? So that
Indeed.
means being careful, err on the side of carefulness. And yes, we discussed last time about this potentially difficult balance between economic activity and health activity. But keeping that in mind, it may be in both, maybe we could figure out in both of those realms, what is the way to act with caution and first do no harm.
Indeed, and I'm going to go back into this article here. There's only a few paragraphs left. We're almost finished with it. So I'm going back to this article from kansascity.com, March 15th, detailing the 1918 so-called what we know commonly as the Spanish flu and its impact on in Kansas City as a result of Kansas City failing to take proper and necessary precautions. So anyway, back to this article. On October 21st, a story in the Kansas City Times described Gannon, the physician, wading into the homes of deathly ill people in McClure Flats. In the rat-infested neighborhood of shanty homes where Hallmark Card's headquarters now sits, he found a tamale vendor preparing food near a filth-infested backyard, piled high with garbage and swarming with flies. "Sure, I make them here every afternoon, and I always sell them out, too," the man is quoted as saying. "And thus goes the infection," Gannon replied. The Kansas City Journal described children playing on a garbage heap near a dying influenza patient. On this garbage pile was poured the slop from the sick room, the newspaper reported. The first gauze masks, 5 layers thick, were seen in the city that night. Soon few people were on the streets without them. Profiteering and hucksterism mounted. Pharmacists sold cures and preventives at inflated prices. Yeah, think of Jim Baker and also Alex Jones. As it became apparent that the war would soon end and America would celebrate, pressure mounted to find good news in the epidemic and to lift Kansas City's bans and quarantines. By October's end, with the death toll at 1,000, less than half of what it would ultimately be, stories declared the epidemic at a standstill. Bans were eased. On Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918, more than 100,000 Kansas Cityans flooded the streets, although many of them were likely sick. In the euphoria over peace, stories about the flu all but disappeared, until it erupted again. By December 4th, the Kansas City Health Department was estimating an average of 107 cases and 17 deaths each day. The Star and the Kansas City Times began running daily tables of mounting deaths. Then as Christmas approached, the cases dwindled. Some 25 persons were still dying each day. On Monday, December 22nd, both the Times and the Star reported that despite 53 new flu cases and 28 deaths, the flu was under control. It would actually linger, ebbing and rising, over months. Within days, bans were lifted, masks came off. Front-page headlines that had talked of death now gave way to this headline on December 23rd. "Expect a White Christmas." And so with that, that is the end of the article, and I'm glad to read this because this is history about my city that I was not aware of. It's very, I mean, it's, I didn't realize, just how much this hit Kansas City, and then you see the implications of, not taking action to shut down major events where people would be in contact with each other and spreading this. And so, reading this makes me, regardless of what the consequences of this turn out to be as far as from a physical death toll or whatnot, or how much suffering there is, I'm glad that for this reason that there is action being taken to possibly preempt something like this from spreading to the worst possible extremes that it could have. So, I mean, this really, to me, it just, from my perspective, we've seen this history before here, and so it makes you think, what could the worst possible scenario be? And, you do need to take action right now. And I mean, business be damned for a while. Let's make sure that we're at least doing something that we know can be done as a precaution. I mean, you can never control what is actually going to happen as far as, spreading of things, but I mean, these are easy, simple, obvious, logical steps that I think do need to be taken for at least a period of time.
Yes, and for those who think it's overblown, people should go read through some of the direct experiences from people both within and without the Italian medical system in relationship to how this is all going down there.
Mm-hmm.
And because, people, we have a tendency to, understandably think only about our own self and exactly what might happen if we were to encounter, the virus or something like that, and how it might go down for us, without thinking about the additive stresses on the medical system that it might happen with more and more people dealing with it, and especially in relationship to taking care of our elders. The way things are set up, it's already difficult enough for them in terms of how, rather than in large part integrating our elders and keeping them in our families, there's a tendency to, put them in homes away from us, and, and be isolated. And those that still stay in their home have a harder time making sure that they have everything that they need to live. And so in the midst of all of that, those pre-existing conditions, social, economic conditions in our country, for example, there is now then the apparent, intensely over threat against our elders in relationship to the way that this virus is presenting itself now. So I think that it, for some of the 20-year-olds who think that they are above all that, and this won't, they'll get, very minor symptoms, if anything. At the very least, we need to think through how this could affect our elders. And whoa, Greg, whoa, it's really
Okay.
loud. Okay, it's okay. So let's now then read through an article. It's interesting. This article was published in 2018, I believe in November of 2018, on Health Impact News by Kevin Berry, who it says is the president of First Freedoms Incorporated. And the title is, Did a Military Experimental Vaccine in 1918 Kill 50 to 100 million people blamed as quote-unquote Spanish flu? Okay, this is being republished other places now because it's obviously potentially relevant to our current moment. And then, so following up in terms of the geography, our personal geography right now, Greg, and the Kansas
Yes.
City story that you just read, and what's going on now in Kansas City, where it seems that is beginning to be some momentum towards erring on the side of caution, potentially in a way that 100 years ago those decisions maybe were not made for various reasons that you read through there. Let's now turn to the Kansas geography. And, I'm here recording in Lawrence, Kansas. It's like I've called it the radical middle of America. There's a deep tradition here, a rich tradition and background here. But then also to the west here are places like Manhattan, Kansas, which is where Plum Island, the lab, the infamous lab where there are a lot of questions in relationship to things like Lyme disease, for example. And I don't know all of the background of that, so I'm not going to speak to that. But that has now been transferred, apparently. Those functions have now been transferred to Manhattan, Kansas, where the Kansas State University is. And so that's a major operation going on there. But then also is Fort Riley, a military base here in Kansas that has been alleged to have been the epicenter, the real epicenter of the quote unquote Spanish flu. And so it's possible that the Spanish flu was actually maybe not even the Kansas flu, but was the Kansas pandemic, might have been called that. So let's read through this, and editorial, saying that we don't agree with everything that's being stated here in terms of all of this, but we think this is a very interesting consideration historically about maybe how we might want to think about how very large scale analyses and narratives around such big things as global pandemics are potentially still being people are being misled about at a mass scale potentially. Okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So I am reading this now that on algora.com, republished on February 6, 2020. The title being here, Spanish flu of 1918 was really a bioterror attack on humanity. Okay. So by Kevin Barry. Okay. Quote, the quote unquote Spanish flu killed an estimated 50 to 100 million people during a pandemic, 1918 to 1919. What if the story we have been told about this pandemic isn't true? What if instead the killer infection was neither the flu nor Spanish in origin? Newly analyzed documents reveal that the quote-unquote Spanish flu may have been a military vaccine experiment gone awry. In looking back on the 100th anniversary of the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, we need to delve deeper to solve this mystery. Summary. Point 1. The reason modern technology has been able to pinpoint the killer influenza strain from this pandemic is because influenza was not the killer. Next point. More soldiers died during World War I from disease than from bullets. Next point. The pandemic was not flu. An estimated 95% or higher of the deaths were caused by bacterial pneumonia, not influenza virus. Next point. The pandemic was not Spanish. The first cases of bacterial pneumonia in 1918 traced back to a military base in Fort Riley, Kansas. Next point. From January 21st to June 4th, 1918, an experimental bacterial meningitis vaccine cultured in horses by the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York was injected into soldiers at Fort Riley. Next point. During the remainder of 1918, as those soldiers, often living and traveling under poor sanitary conditions, were sent to Europe to fight, they spread bacteria at every stop between Kansas and the frontline trenches in France. Next point. One study described soldiers, quote, with active infections who were aerosolizing the bacteria that colonized their noses and throats, while others, often in the same quote-unquote breathing spaces, were profoundly susceptible to invasion of and rapid spread through their lungs by their own or others' colonizing bacteria, unquote. Next point. The quote-unquote Spanish flu attacked healthy people in their prime. Bacterial pneumonia attacks people in their prime. Flu attacks the young, old, and immunocompromised. Next point. When World War I ended on November 11th, 1918, soldiers returned to their home countries and colonial outposts, spreading the killer bacterial pneumonia worldwide. Next point. During World War I, the Rockefeller Institute also sent the anti-meningococcic serum to England, France, Belgium, Italy, and other countries, helping spread the epidemic worldwide. Okay, end of those points. Continuing on. During the pandemic of 1918-19, the so-called quote-unquote Spanish flu killed 50 to 100 million people, including many soldiers. Many people do not realize that disease killed far more soldiers on all sides than machine guns or mustard gas or anything else typically associated with World War I. I have a personal connection to the Spanish flu. Among those killed by disease in 1918-19 are members of both of my parents' families. On my father's side, his grandmother, Sadie Hoyt, died from pneumonia in 1918. Sadie was a chief yeoman in the Navy. Her death left my grandmother, Rosemary, and her sister, Anita, to be raised by their aunt. Sadie's sister, Marian, also joined the Navy. She died from, quote, the influenza, unquote, in 1919. On my mother's side, two of her father's sisters died in childhood. All of the family members who died lived in New York City. I suspect many American families and many families worldwide were impacted in similar ways by the mysterious Spanish flu. In 1918, quote-unquote influenza or flu was a catch-all term for disease of unknown origin. It didn't carry the specific meaning it does today. It meant some mystery disease which dropped out of the sky. In fact, influenza is from the medieval Latin, quote, influential, unquote, in an astrological sense, meaning a visitation under the influence of the stars. Why is what happened 100 years ago important now? Between 1900 and 1920, there were enormous efforts underway in the industrialized world to build a better society. I will use New York as an example to discuss three major changes to society which occurred in New York during that time and their impact on mortality from infectious diseases. 1. Clean water and sanitation. In the late 19th century through the early 20th century, New York built an extraordinary system to bring clean water to the city from the Catskills, a system still in use today. New York City also built over 6,000 miles of sewer to take away and treat waste, which protects the drinking water. The World Health Organization acknowledges the importance of clean water and sanitation in combating infectious diseases. 2. Electricity. In the late 19th century through the early 20th century, New York built a power grid and wired the city so power was available in every home. Electricity allows for refrigeration. Refrigeration is an unsung hero as a public health benefit. When food is refrigerated from farm to table, the public is protected from potential infectious diseases. Cheap renewable energy is important for many reasons, including combating infectious diseases. 3. Pharmaceutical. In the late 19th century through the early 20th century, New York became the home of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now Rockefeller University. The institute is where the modern pharmaceutical industry was born. The institute pioneered many of the approaches the pharmaceutical industry uses today, including the preparation of vaccine serums, for better or worse. The vaccine used in the Fort Riley experiment on soldiers was made in horses. U.S. mortality rates data from the turn of the 20th century to 1965 clearly indicates that clean water, flushing toilets, effective sewer systems, and refrigerated foods all combined to effectively reduce mortality from infectious diseases before vaccines for those diseases became available. Have doctors and the pharmaceutical manufacturers taken credit for reducing mortality from infectious diseases, which rightfully belongs to sandhogs, plumbers, electricians, and engineers? If hubris at the Rockefeller Institute in 1918 led to a pandemic disease which killed millions of people, what lessons can we learn and apply to 2018? The disease was not Spanish. While watching an episode of American Experience on PBS a few months ago, I was surprised to hear that the first cases of quote-unquote Spanish flu occurred at Fort Riley, Kansas in 1918. I thought, how is it possible this historically important event could be so badly misnamed 100 years ago and never corrected? Why quote-unquote Spanish? Spain was one of a few countries not involved in World War I. Most of the countries involved in the war censored their press. Free from censorship concerns, the earliest press reports of people dying from disease in large numbers came from Spain. The warring countries did not want to additionally frighten the troops, so they were content to scapegoat Spain. Soldiers on all sides would be asked to cross no man's land into machine gun fire, which was frightening enough without knowing that the trenches were a disease breeding ground. Okay, and aside there, I mean, just that point alone is intensely significant to our current moment because it applies both, I would say, to the Chinese and the American governments at this point. And I then would say that as we begin to pay more attention to this kind of analysis, to think about the role of war, not only in relationship to the spread of disease, but also in relationship to the spread of propaganda and censorship, right? The truth being the first casualty in war.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Also, something that kind of comes a little full circle here. This is something I noticed. I mentioned to you earlier when we were talking was that remember the war. It was 20 years prior to this. 1898 was the Spanish-American War, which was based on the yellow journalism of William Randolph Hearst and his media empire at the time of the USS Maine attack, which turns out actually did not actually take place. And that was the war that began the U.S. as from what we know, now as a global empire, basically. And then the First World War was the U.S.'s, I think, the first major international event where the U.S. sent troops over to Europe in a mass scale to fight a foreign war. And this was really, I would say this, and then obviously the Second World War solidified the U.S. as the, I guess what we know now as like the preeminent global military power. And it's interesting, it comes full circle from the Spanish-American War of 1898 to now 1918. This flu being called the Spanish flu being taken over to Europe out of Fort Riley, Kansas. So.
Okay. All right, back to this article. Quote, 100 years later, it's long past time to drop, quote unquote, Spanish from all discussion of this pandemic. If the flu started at a United States military base in Kansas, then the disease could and should be more aptly named. In order to prevent future disasters, the U.S. and the rest of the world must take a hard look at what really caused the pandemic. It is possible that one of the reasons the Spanish flu has never been corrected is that it helps disguise the origin of the pandemic. If the origin of the pandemic involved a vaccine experiment on U.S. soldiers, then the U.S. may prefer calling it Spanish flu instead of the Fort Riley bacteria of 1918 or something similar. The Spanish flu started at the location this experimental bacterial vaccine was given, making it the prime suspect as the source of the bacterial infections which killed so many. It would be much more difficult to maintain the marketing mantra of, quote, vaccines save lives, unquote, if a vaccine experiment originating in the United States during the years of primitive manufacturing caused the deaths of 50 to 100 million people. The disease which killed so many was not flu or a virus, it was bacterial. During the mid-2000s, there was much talk about, quote, pandemic preparedness, unquote. Influenza vaccine manufacturers in the United States receive billions of taxpayer dollars to develop vaccines to make sure that we don't have another lethal pandemic, quote-unquote, flu like the one in 1918-19. Capitalizing on the quote-unquote flu part of Spanish flu helped vaccine manufacturers procure billion-dollar checks from governments, even though scientists knew at the time that bacterial pneumonia was the real killer. It is not my opinion that bacterial pneumonia was the real killer. Thousands of autopsies confirm this fact. According to a 2008 National Institute of Health paper, bacterial pneumonia was the killer in a minimum of 92.7% of the 1918-19 autopsies reviewed. It is likely higher than 92.7%. The researchers looked at more than 9,000 autopsies and, quote, there were no negative bacterial lung culture results, unquote. Quote, in the 68, and this is, I believe, from that investigation from that National Institute of Health paper, 2008, quote, in the 68 higher quality autopsy series in which the possibility of unreported negative cultures could be excluded, 92.7% of autopsy lung cultures were positive for greater than one bacterium. In one study of approximately 9,000 subjects who were followed from clinical presentation with influenza to resolution or autopsy, researchers obtained with sterile technique cultures of either pneumococci or streptococci from 164 of 167 lung tissue samples. There were 89 pure cultures of pneumococci, 19 cultures from which only streptococci were recovered, 34 that yielded mixtures of pneumococci and or streptococci, 22 that yield a mixture of pneumococci, streptococci, and other organisms, prominently pneumococci and non-hemolytic streptococci, and 3 that yielded non-hemolytic streptococci alone. There were no negative lung culture results. That's the end of the quote from that paper. Back to the article. Pneumococci or streptococci were found in, quote, 164 of the 167 lung tissue samples, unquote, autopsied. That is 98.2% bacteria was the killer. Where did the Spanish flu bacterial pneumonia of 1918-19 originate? When the United States declared war in April 1917, the fledgling pharmaceutical industry had something they had never had before, a large supply of human test subjects in the form of the U.S. military's first draft. Pre-war in 1917, the U.S. Army was 286,000 men. Post-war in 1920, the U.S. Army disbanded and had 296,000 men. During the war years, 1918 to 19, the U.S. Army ballooned to 6 million men, with 2 million men being sent overseas. The Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research took advantage of this new pool of human guinea pigs to conduct vaccine experiments. And here's a title of a paper: A Report on Anti-Meningitis Vaccination and Observations on Agglutinins in the Blood of Chronic Meningococcus Carriers, by Frederick L. Gates, from the Base Hospital, Fort Riley, Kansas, and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, New York, received 1918, July 20th. Author note: please read the Fort Riley paper in its entirety so you can appreciate the carelessness of the experiments conducted on these troops. Between January 21st and June 4th of 1918, Dr. Gates reports on an experiment where soldiers were given 3 doses of a bacterial meningitis vaccine. Those conducting the experiment on the soldiers were just spitballing dosages of a vaccine serum made in horses. The vaccination regime was designed to be 3 doses. 4,792 men received the first dose, but only 4,257 got the second dose, down 11%, and only 3,702 received all 3 doses, down 22.7%. A total of 1,090 men were not there for the third dose. What happened to these soldiers? Were they shipped east by train from Kansas to board a ship to Europe? Were they in the Fort Riley Hospital? Dr. Gates' report doesn't tell us. An article accompanying the American Experience broadcast I watched shed some light on where these 1,090 men might be. Gates began his experiments in January 1918. By March of that year, quote, 100 men a day, unquote, were entering the infirmary at Fort Riley. Are some of these the men missing from Dr. Gates' reports, the ones who did not get the second or third dose? Quote, shortly before breakfast on Monday, March 11th, the first domino would fall, signaling the commencement of the first wave of the 1918 influenza. Company cook Albert Gitchell reported to the camp infirmary with complaints of a, quote, bad cold, unquote. Right behind him came Corporal Lee W. Drake, voicing similar complaints. By noon, camp surgeon Edward R. Schreiner had over 100 sick men on his hands, all apparently suffering from the same malady, unquote. Gates does report that several of the men in the experiment had flu-like symptoms, coughs, vomiting, and diarrhea after receiving the vaccine. These symptoms are a disaster for men living in barracks, traveling on trains to the Atlantic coast, sailing to Europe, and living and fighting in trenches. The unsanitary conditions at each step of the journey are an ideal environment for a contagious disease like bacterial pneumonia to spread. From Dr. Gates' report, quote, reactions: several cases of looseness of the bowels or transient diarrhea were noted. This symptom had not been encountered before. Careful inquiry in individual cases often elicited the information that men who complained of the effects of vaccination were suffering from mild coryza, bronchitis, etc. at the time of the injection, unquote. Quote, sometimes the reaction was initiated by a chill or a chilly sensation, and a number of men complained of fever or feverish sensations during the following night. Next in frequency came nausea, occasionally vomiting, dizziness, and general, quote, aches and pains, unquote, in the joints and muscles, which in a few instances were especially localized in the neck or lumbar region, causing stiff neck or stiff back. A few injections were followed by diarrhea. The reactions, therefore, occasionally simulated the onset of epidemic meningitis, and several vaccinated men were sent as suspects to the base hospital for diagnosis, unquote. According to Gates, they injected random dosages of an experimental bacterial meningitis vaccine into soldiers. Afterwards, some of the soldiers had symptoms which, quote-unquote, simulated meningitis, but Dr. Gates advances the fantastical claim that it wasn't actual meningitis. The soldiers developed flu-like symptoms. Bacterial meningitis then and now is known to mimic flu-like symptoms. Perhaps the similarity of early symptoms of bacterial meningitis and bacterial pneumonia to symptoms of flu is why the vaccine experiments at Fort Riley have been able to escape scrutiny as a potential cause of the Spanish flu for 100 years and counting. How did the quote-unquote Spanish flu spread so widely so quickly? There is an element of a perfect storm in how the Gates bacteria spread. World War I ended only 10 months after the first injections. Unfortunately for the 50 to 100 million who died, those soldiers injected with horse-infused bacteria moved quickly during those 10 months. An article from 2008 on the CDC's website describes how sick World War I soldiers could pass along the bacteria to others by becoming, quote, cloud adults, unquote. Quote from that. Finally, for brief periods and to varying degrees, affected hosts became, quote unquote, cloud adults, who increased the aerosolization of colonizing strains of bacteria, particularly pneumococci, hemolytic streptococci, H. influenzae, and S. aureus. For several days during local epidemics, particularly in crowded settings such as hospital wards, military camps, troop ships, and mines and trenches, some persons were immunologically susceptible to, infected with, or recovering from infections with influenza virus. Persons with active infections were aerosolizing the bacteria that colonized their noses and throats, while others, often in the same quote-unquote breathing spaces, were profoundly susceptible to invasion of and rapid spread through their lungs by their own or others' colonizing bacteria, unquote. 3 times in his report on the Fort Riley vaccine experiment, Dr. Gates states that some soldiers had a, quote, severe reaction, unquote, indicating, quote, an unusual individual susceptibility to the vaccine, unquote. While the vaccine made many sick, it only killed those who were susceptible to it. Those who became sick and survived became, quote, cloud adults, unquote, who spread the bacteria to others, which created more cloud adults, spreading to others where it killed the susceptible, repeating the cycle until there were no longer wartime unsanitary conditions and there were no longer millions of soldiers to experiment on. The toll on U.S. troops was enormous, and it is well documented. Dr. Carol Byerly describes how the quote-unquote influenza traveled like wildfire through the U.S. military. Substitute quote-unquote bacteria for Dr. Byerly's quote-unquote influenza or quote-unquote virus. And so here we're in our last minute here, and so we're going to have to hold off from finishing the rest of this. But we will link to this article, which goes into a bunch more towards this end of analysis. Greg, any final points?
Yeah, I'm glad we're reading from this because, I mean, 2 things. Number one, you have this. There's going to be a major campaign for vaccines once if there is a vaccination that comes out for this. And there's a lot, I don't want to use this, and there's a lot of obvious debate over the effectiveness of vaccinations. And so that's one thing to take into consideration with this, is that there is going to be that's going to become a major part of the conversation eventually here. And also just the history of this, if you want to ask questions about where things like this come from, where they originate from. I mean, this right here is crucial information that is very much, that's not known as far as the actual history of what we know as the Spanish flu. So these raises some serious questions even to now.
Agreed. All right. Until next time, Greg, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy.